It's Tuesday, and you know what that means. Chad and I are back to dive into the real-world challenges and successes of medical affairs leadership. With insights from Chad and other industry leaders, you can't go wrong. After all, leaders don't develop in isolation. Leaders learn from leaders. And we're so glad you're here. Stay tuned.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of MSLead Chronicles. I am your host, Chad Fellers, with my nifty sidekick, Mary the Fabulous, the woman of many tricks and trades, Morton. How are you, Mary?
I'm doing terrific, as
Yeah?
always.
Yeah? Are
How
you
are
cold?
you today?
I'm cold. I'm cold. It is. I can't get over this. I mean, we are in February, but living in the South, I thought there's a reason for that, and that's to avoid the cold weather that you might get in the Northeast or in the Minnesota region, any of those types. No offense by any means. I'm just not built for that, and it is like 20-something degrees in Arkansas, and that is miserable. How is it there in Austin for you?
Well, I was about to show you, if you've ever heard what they say about the weather in Texas, if you don't like the weather, just wait a while because it's going to change. So let's figure out, this is our weather for this week.
I can't see it, so maybe you can, and I don't know if what does it say? Warm, cold, cold, warm, like that?
Well, it says today, 66 for a high, 35 for a low.
Yeah.
And then if you look at a week later, 75 for a high. It was also 70 degrees on Saturday.
That's the kind of weather that I am looking forward to, and hopefully it will come soon. But anyway, definitely had a great conversation last episode, and really looking forward to this as well too. I can't wait. So let's just go ahead and let's dig in. And why don't you go ahead and introduce our host? It's around the conversation of patient advocacy. I know we've got a lot of requests for this, and it's come up quite often. So let's get things going. Why don't you introduce our guest?
I'm actually going to let her do more of the introduction herself.
Okay.
But today we have the amazing Margaret Alabi, who is joining us to talk with us a little bit about patient advocacy, which is a really hot topic. As someone who talks to people in field medical all the time, and they're trying to figure out what's my next career move, and I like to get into patient advocacy. And the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And this has been a passion for Margaret for a really long time. And I wanted to say, I really thought getting this episode in February was a great idea because it is Rare Disease Month. And so this episode is going to be airing right around Rare Disease Day, which is why I've got on my Show Your Stripes shirt from last year. We had the pleasure of placing Margaret years ago, like almost 10 years ago, it seems like, in an MSL position. And then she moved on to the things that really meant something to her. And I'm going to let her talk about that. With that, Margaret, why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about you?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mary and Chad. It's definitely a pleasure to be here with you. And I am loving your Show Your Stripe shirt. I was going to say that's a reference to Nord for sure. So that is awesome, and super excited to be having this episode air around the National Rare Disease Day. So as Mary's already kind of alluded to, we have a long-standing relationship from the time that she and her team placed me at Takeda, or Shire, now Takeda, in an MSL role. And it was from that MSL role that I was really able to hone in on the therapeutic area that really excites me the most, and that's immunology, because it is so vast and so wide, and there are just so many different things that we're discovering about how the baseline immune system and just immunology in general impacts various facets of disease and conditions that are becoming more and more frequent nowadays. Like, when we were younger, there were certain conditions that were completely unheard of, but now are super commonplace. So for me, it's just been exciting to be able to couple my PharmD education with my ability to really enhance the way that patient advocacy groups are addressing awareness, education, and access for people living with severe conditions. And specifically, right now, I'm focused on U.S. and global dermatology in patient advocacy with Regeneron.
This is going to be a fun conversation. I can't wait. So good, Margaret. It's great to meet you first and foremost for me. So I haven't had a chance to get to know you very, very much yet, but just from the short time already, you're such an engaging person. It's going to be really good for me to learn from you as well as the other listeners. With that, one of the things that we do to start off our podcast is really we want to give the key takeaways of what is it that you want our listeners to walk away from if they only have a few minutes just to listen in. So with that, do you have a few things that you want to share just to leave with the listeners?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I think it's important for folks to understand that patient advocacy directly shapes the company's reputation and relationship with patient communities. And this extends well beyond fundraising events because the goal of having these relationships is to truly create meaningful and lasting impact. Again, to harp on the relationships that most of our companies who work in rare disease have with NORD, it's by ensuring that we are there to support the efforts of these communities through really, beyond just the financial support. Again, there are a number of ways, and we'll get into that throughout this conversation. And then the second takeaway is the fact that the building of these enduring relationships and partnerships with patient communities actually ensures that individuals can make informed decisions about their health while also accessing appropriate treatments. And I harp on the word appropriate treatments because our company's treatment might not be best for them, but if a patient has education on their condition, they're able to be more informed about how they're approaching their disease journey. And this makes advocacy a fundamental player for both patient care and business success.
Let's dig into this, but what you just said, I have to follow up on this. I think it's so key. I think the idea, when we get into the MSL role even, or just in the field medical, a lot of it's because we're passionate about patients, we're passionate about health. And just in my limited experience with interacting with some of the patient advocacy groups, you talk about groups that are savvy and passionate and learning about voice of the patient, all these types of things. I mean, this is such an area where you can really see the impact of the value that can be brought to the various groups. And this is certainly one group that's crucial. It's something that is really rewarding. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, Margaret. But would love to hear a little bit more about your journey and then what led you to patient advocacy.
Okay, this is like the favorite part of my story. So thank you for asking, Chad. So I learned very early on when I was in pharmacy school that I talk too much and that the likelihood of patients actually leaving the pharmacy on time with their prescriptions was going to be very low. And I had a number of, key points and evidence to prove that I am the rate limiting factor for people getting out of the pharmacy on time. So I really began to explore, what other avenues I could, pursue with my love for talking and advocating for people. And so while I was in pharmacy school, I stumbled upon the Rutgers postdoctoral fellowship program. And the key opportunity that stood out to me across all of the various programs that they offered was in patient advocacy. So it was health policy, patient advocacy. And I just set my sights on that fellowship opportunity and I got it. And that's actually where I entered the pharmaceutical industry, was through that postdoctoral fellowship. And I had a first row or front row seat at watching some of the leading industry titans in this patient advocacy space do their thing. I also had the pleasure of being a part of building a way of engaging patient advocates that hadn't been done before in this industry. And that was during my time at Sanofi during that fellowship. So after I did that 2-year fellowship, I wanted to gain some more experience beyond just advocacy. It's like, okay, great. I really want to understand um, how other parts of this business work. So I was given the chance to be a part of one of the first ever pharmacy account management teams that Sanofi had at the time. And so that was like a hybrid commercial role. I wasn't directly working with physicians, but I was working with my sales reps partners and key pharmacy uh, locations that we had identified that would be very important for ensuring patients were getting the treatment that the physician prescribed. So after that, I said, okay, that was nice and fun. Let me dig into my PharmD bag and move into an MSL role. So I had the pleasure of joining Fresenius Renal Therapies Group, working specifically in renal therapies to educate dietitians as well as nephrologists on the value of an oral phosphate binder, which was cool. And that's when I met Mary and team. And they were able to get me on over to Shire, now Takeda. And that's where I fell in love with immunology. And I will say that across all of my various experiences, I maintained and was very clear with my leaders that patient advocacy was still at my heart. And so I found a way to do something patient advocacy related with each of those roles. So even when I was at Fresenius, I helped them to initiate and create their first ever patient advisory board because they were vertically integrated as an organization. So it just made sense to not just talk about the oral phosphate binders, but to also get the patient's insights and thoughts on the dialysis machines that were also created by Fresenius, right? So it's just like, you have a wealth of knowledge here. How can we help you really harness this knowledge to improve the product that the patients are engaging with, and hopefully improve, how your business is operating, right? Because now you have a better understanding of what works directly from the voice of the patient. When I got to Shire, now Takeda, I was also given the opportunity to help launch their hereditary angioedema treatment for called Takhzyro. And that was amazing because that is a very rare patient population, super small. And even during that time, I was given the opportunity to engage with one of the leading patient advocacy groups in that space to really educate on the value that Takeda was bringing to that community by really having listened to these patients and understanding what dose and administration meant to being able to live a full and complete life. And from there, I transitioned into a medical director role with UCB Pharma, focusing on Crohn's disease and their GI product there. And shortly after I got that role, an awesome opportunity opened up at UCB that would allow me to do all patient advocacy, immunology focused work. And at that time with UCB, it was rheumatology and dermatology. So I had a blast operating across about 10 or so indications for UCB before taking this role that I'm operating in right now with Regeneron, and focused predominantly on dermatology, but still with that immunology underlying, tone, which is really important for me.
If we can back up just a little bit, because like, as I mentioned earlier, I talk to a lot of people who want to get into patient advocacy.
Yes.
And I always want to understand why, because if they're not familiar with it, or, what are the components of it that they like? So, and then I oftentimes will go on to ask them, what do you think you'll be doing if you were to get into a patient advocacy role? And oftentimes they don't know. Just the idea of being an advocate to patients, but not really knowing what all that means. So, very long introduction to my question, which is, for the people who maybe don't understand all the ins and outs of what a patient advocacy role is, can you tell the audience and the listeners a little bit about what it entails?
And I'm loving Chad's hat. Yes, I'm loving your hat, Chad. So this is one of my favorite questions to answer, Mary, because it's important for folks to understand that patient advocacy is not just about attending events and pictures and capturing pictures, but there's a huge strategic imperative associated with operating in patient advocacy beyond just building the relationship between your organization and the patient advocacy community. It's important to really understand how you, as a patient advocacy functional lead, can really help connect the business priorities to the priorities of the patient community. And sometimes that translation isn't always clean, right? Because there are things that the business might think are a priority, which are in complete and direct conflict with how the patient community views their goals and their aspirations for what great looks like for people living with the condition. And so as a person operating in this function, it's important to remember whose voice matters the most, and to be able to do that translation for your business colleagues to really help them understand that while I get that this is, ABCD goal, right? The patient community values this the most. And here, by addressing what the patient advocacy community is looking for, we can still help you reach your business goal. And so being able to prove and or show that you've got some background in making those connections, or you've got some experience in really making that translation happen for the business and the patient community, I think are key when you are looking to transition into a patient advocacy role. Because again, passion is great. It's definitely a wonderful part of the equation to have. But you've got to have the strategic mind. You've got to have the project management orientation. And you've got to have the relationship building, because it is a lot of talking. It is a lot of operating across multiple internal functions. Sometimes those functions are within your, like for me, I'm in corporate affairs. So sometimes it's just connecting with my communications partners who occupy corporate affairs with me, or connecting with my corporate social responsibility partners. But oftentimes it's working across medical, it's working across commercial, it's working across R&D in some instances as well, really just to ensure that everything that we're doing has a clear connection back to the patient community in a way that the community will receive. So you can pretty much think of the patient advocacy function as the not representing one voice, not one patient voice, but an aggregate voice of the community, which I think is really important and sometimes gets lost on people because they're like, oh, can you get me a patient? And it's just like, well, I work with a group that has a number of patients, and they are operating to ensure that the larger collective of people living with this condition have their needs met. It's not a singular voice.
So talk about who all you engage when you're talking about these groups, right? Because it could be, from my understanding, it could be not only patients, but it could be caregivers. It could be clinicians that support that are part of a board. So tell us what all that entails, Margaret.
Yeah, no, that is great, and thank you for asking that, Chad. So yes, there are patient advocacy groups that we engage with. There are professional medical societies that we engage with, and for sure, caregivers are right in there, and especially depending on the population that we're approaching. Caregivers can be parents, and or they can be children or partners or spouses of the person living with the condition. And then when we tap into the professional medical societies, again, our goal for engaging with them is really to focus in and hone in on their patient-facing activities. And yes, we partner with professional medical societies on a number of levels, but when it's patient, for my function, that making it clear that we want to understand and support any activities that are going to truly improve the life and the experience of the patient is key. So that's externally. Internally, we operate across a number of functions. So just about every medical function that you can think of, like right now, on my global side, we've got a really great thing happening with our HEOR colleagues, so health economics outcome research colleagues, as it relates to the cumulative impact and burden of atopic disease on the lives of people. And so that's one collaboration. Then I collaborate very closely with my HCP marketing, my consumer marketing, you name it. Patient advocacy engages and can engage with the entire organization based on the ask.
Well, yeah. And this is something she and I talked about before. But for the listeners, I would love for them to get to hear, because this is also sometimes a little bit of confusion for people who are kind of on the outside of the patient side of things, is like, what is the difference between patient advocacy and patient engagement?
Yeah, no, that is great. So patient engagement typically is preclinical or pre-commercial work. And patient engagement predominantly focuses on, and this changes, and for the listeners, hopefully, every company is quite different in how they term things. However, generally speaking, patient engagement is really focused on that clinical research aspect and how are you getting patients engaged in the clinical trials that an organization is looking to do, whether that be pre-commercial and sometimes even post-commercial, right? Looking at how to approach the patient community, make them aware of the trials that are available and get them in the door. Whereas patient advocacy can also be done pre-commercial, right? However, again, the difference here is that it's not just focused on that clinical research aspect, like patient engagement. It's focused on an array of things. And those three things typically fall in the bucket of awareness of the condition, education around the condition, and then access. And access can take on an array of things as well, right? Whether that is access to the proper care, access to the most appropriate treatment, you name it. And so I would say those are the key distinguishing factors between patient engagement and patient advocacy. Advocacy is a long game. It is not for spurts at times. For instance, a clinical trial has an end date. A condition doesn't necessarily have an end date per se. So that you are there to ensure that your organization has a good relationship with the community and maintains a great relationship with the community through patient advocacy.
Even think about kind of the shifting of how we even phrase things as well too with these communities, right? So for example, my closest experience were patients with narcolepsy. So I was introduced to the voice of the patients and that push, but then how important it is to not think about these things, and which I think we're guilty of just as organizations, as projects, but as people, right? So for example, what I mean by that is it's patients with they're not identified by their condition, right? Exactly. That is a part of who they are, but that doesn't define them, right? Exactly. And I think that just shifting that mindset, you talk about the importance of establishing relationships and being the representation of companies to people that are actually going to be on the other end of this. And I think just even small things like that make huge differences as far as building that trust, building that rapport, right? So
absolutely. Just to kind of even build on what you're saying, Chad, one of the things that a great partnership between patient engagement and patient advocacy is when patient advocacy can really bring some, again, the people that represent the aggregate voice of the patient as opposed to one individual patient to the table, because advocacy groups are getting all kinds of information and insights from the community. Some parts of their community might have a great experience. Others' experience might be vastly different from that, but they're able to aggregate all of that and ensure that as a whole, the community's needs are being addressed and met. And so there have been instances, and I have colleagues in my current company right now whose primary focus is dealing with things before they get commercialized. And so one of the things that particular colleague does is brings the patient advocacy group to the table. While you might have some individual patient voices, thanks to patient engagement, right? But bringing that patient advocacy to the table really helps to create a strong through line of all the voices of patients and how they're experiencing clinical trials, how they're getting the opportunity to have input or give voice to protocol, right? And what clinical trial protocols could or should look like for people living with this condition, right? So that both parties are having a great experience. So those are just some key, things I wanted to just point out, because I don't want to minimize the patient engagement role, because it is massive. But just really trying to give one example of how the two come together.
And that's what I was getting ready to ask is, it seems like there's so much to the role that the priorities, probably your initiatives and what have you, probably are shifting all the time. Well, not all the time, but but I would say it's probably a more diverse of a role than anything that we encounter in the industry. I mean, if you're a packaging design engineer, I mean, maybe you're designing a different package, but your job is not vastly different.
Right.
And
right.
It's got to be a very enriching career.
It definitely is, because there is never a dull moment. There's always something, right? And even if there's nothing, you can still find something that gives you like that spark to really just approach your role in a different way, or figure out a new way or an improved way of engaging with the patient community. So yeah, patient advocacy is not boring by any stretch of the imagination. And that is across the board, whether you're dealing with external stakeholders or internal stakeholders. There's always something cool to do. Like I'm sure across the industry, many organizations are seeing the rise of plain language summaries. So that is something that we work with our publications team, partnering with them and our patient advocates to help author or co-author some of those plain language summaries. So, there's never, you're never at a loss for things to do. It's just a matter of, what's on strategy for your organization and for, the business. And then what is of importance to the patient community, and making sure that you're matching those two things with the utmost respect and care. Because again, as I mentioned, while we know and we understand what the business has in mind as a non-revenue generating function, my job is really to ensure that we are not doing anything that would harm or be detrimental to our relationship with the people that we are creating the product to serve.
That actually reminds me of a conversation you and I had a couple weeks ago. And, we were, I was telling you about the hidradenitis suppurativa meeting that I had attended, and what an engaged group of patients.
Yes.
I've never seen anything like it. It was so, I can't even describe the emotion. And that's got to be one of the ways that someone in patient advocacy can reflect how are we doing.
Oh yeah.
And look how these, I think in some rare diseases that probably patients give up on trying to advocate for themselves at some point because they're not getting information, or they're not they're not feeling included.
Right.
And to see the way that these people were engaged, and they spoke their mind, the things that they loved, the things that they didn't like, the things they needed more of. But that's got to be very positive reinforcement for them to have industry be so clear about, we want to hear what you have to say. And we're here, pharma gets a little bit of a bad rep, right? And so I think patient advocacy, like you said, about how you impact the relationship, but also the reputation.
Absolutely.
Of how a company is perceived. But I didn't know if you wanted to speak a little bit about that.
Yes, because the HS community is one community that's very near and dear to my heart. I actually, one of the patient advocacy leaders in that space is a really good friend of mine. And this is also a great example to talk about the value that patient advocacy brings to organizations. And so, as you mentioned, that community is very clear about what works and what doesn't work, because they've engaged and encountered things with our industry, unfortunately, that didn't work, right? And it is imperative to have a patient advocacy function that is in tune and connected with, and actually, again, not only is listening to the community, but is doing the translation. Because at the end of the day, pharma is it's a for-profit industry, right? So while we definitely have the desire to create products that change the lives of people, that also comes at a cost. So how then do you translate what the patients need and want and are looking for into things that are of value to the folks that are tasked with selling this product, right? And that cannot be done in a vacuum. It cannot be done with again, one patient voice. You have to be able to tap into the wide range of the community, because everybody's experience is different. And the HS community is one of those that they really rocked my world when I came in with the assumption that hidradenitis suppurativa was rare. They said, hey, look, Margaret, we're not rare. We're rarely talked about. And so then I took that as my, charge to spread that message as well. Is like, this community of patients is tired of being termed as rare. They are tired of being misnomered as a disease of ethnicity, because there are different ethnicities that are going undiagnosed, because the physician sees this condition, they automatically assume it has to be something else because this only occurs in one ethnicity versus the other. So as a patient advocate, having the time to sit down and really dig into the questions that this community had, and really, just kind of illuminate or bring light to a lot of the misconceptions and a lot of the pain, a lot of the missteps of our industry with this community, and being able to now take that and translate that back into a way that the business colleagues could understand, so that they could move differently and engage with this population in a way that's respectful, meaningful, and enduring. That's my job. That is my job. And I do believe that community is getting its due as we speak. I do believe they are definitely enjoying a much better relationship with industry, because the tables have turned. We're incorporating their language. We're not just asking them for feedback and then going off and doing our own thing. We're asking them for feedback, and we are being very thoughtful, considerate, and clear about what we can incorporate and what, just based on regulations and compliance, that we're unable to address, but that we hear and we know and we understand.
Margaret, one of the things you talked about, I thought that was, or keywords that kind of stuck out to me, the importance of strategic thinking. Yeah. I think in this role, and I would love for you to expand on that a little bit. I think one of the things, just from an observation from leading field teams, and even really trying, there's some great MSLs out there that are fantastic at scientific content and thinking along those lines. I think one of the where the magic is where you understand how you can be the bridge, the scientific bridge, in whatever passion the person that you're engaging is, right? So what that requires is nonlinear thinking in ways. So can you talk a little bit about that skill and how that would really supports specifically this type of role in patient advocacy?
Absolutely. So I love that you mentioned the nonlinear thinking, and so much of the work from a medical affairs perspective is very clear, right? You're typically reactive as opposed to proactive. You are answering a question. You are answering that question with very clear data to support your answer. That is not always the case in patient advocacy because, again, every human has an individual experience that cannot always be explained with one or two data points. So how then do you begin to craft an awareness campaign? How then do you begin to really suss out what educational gaps exist for patients? And again, that is through that relationship. That is through asking those questions, not quite the way that you would ask a physician to really understand what's missing for them, but in some ways there is a little bit of that in there as well. But then once you've gathered all of that information, it's then on you to step back and see, okay, great. If I zoom out with the tools that I'm allowed to use that are compliant and meet regulatory standards, how then, what would be most important to this community? So I'll speak about an example of this with my current role. Last year, we engaged the National Eczema Association around atopic dermatitis. And really what we heard from NIA was that they were focusing on understanding what flares mean for patients. And flares are, again, unique, just like every individual. They are unique to that individual. One person might say that a flare is tingling or itching skin, and they know that their atopic dermatitis is about to go off the wall. Others might say that they only flare when they're under stress. So like it takes on different verbiage. So at the end of the day, what do patients ultimately want? They want to be able to control how they're experiencing or when they might be experiencing these flares, which again, if they've got some hints about it, well, how can they be in control of how of their lived experience with the condition? And so we worked very closely with NIA to create an educational session at their live patient expo that could really address and tap into that for patients. Is like, great, you're experiencing this. In my role, I'm barred from talking about treatment. I don't talk drug, which is probably one of the best parts of my role. But then again, really requires that strategic thinking. If I can't say, hey, take XYZ drug, then what can I say? How can I engage this population in a way that would get them to think about all of the options that are available, and then which one of those options best meets their needs after we've had this conversation on this is, this is what's happening. And perhaps you haven't looked at what's happening with you in this manner before, but now that you have, I encourage you to go back and explore, all of the options that are available to you and which one might, be best suited for addressing your need or your condition.
Mary.
Yes.
You're looking at you got that you're thinking based on
I have a question. So when you started talking about, compliantly and whatever, as we've kind of talked about before, this role sometimes sits in commercial, sometimes it sits in medical. Yours, you report through corporate affairs. Mm-hmm. From a compliance standpoint, does that change discussions, interactions, etc., that patient advocacy can have?
Not really. I mean, when you say does it change it, while it might not change it, it definitely informs the types of conversations that we can have, right? So again, all the work that I do is unbranded. I if I'm approached with a branded opportunity, I have to decline it, or I have to pass it to the folks that do that branded work, like our consumer marketing colleagues and things of that nature. But everything in this role, and I would assume that that is accurate across the industry, is unbranded.
Yeah, I mean, because, field medical affairs can't have discussions with patients, right?
That is what I understand.
So I'm just curious about the reporting structure, why some companies would put it under medical affairs. I just kind of would feel like that would get a little confusing.
Yeah. So while they're not having the conversation directly with the patient, again, patient advocacy groups are the voice of an aggregated patient community. So that nine times out of 10, the folks that you're engaging with at a patient advocacy organization are not people who live with the condition. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense.
From that regard, I think it still is okay for this role to be reporting in through medical. And I think another call out there is just based on the size of the company. So sometimes, or most times, this role is seen in corporate affairs in those larger organizations. I'd say mid to large organizations have patient advocacy housed in corporate affairs, but in the instances that they don't, where it's in medical, the other piece of this is, while we are focused predominantly on patient advocacy groups, my role does require me to also engage the professional medical societies. And so those professional medical societies are the home to the HCPs and KOLs that many medical affairs, functions engage with. So there's a little bit of a tie or a connect there as well.
And just to add on a little bit to what Margaret said, Mary, I just know from some experiences, there are some companies that will utilize or deploy MSLs maybe to review clinical trials or those types of things as well too, as far as from an awareness standpoint. Can't answer questions or anything like that and have that direct contact from like a one-on-one standpoint, but can inform as far as what is coming with that. So I think it really is the comfort level, probably, Margaret, right, of each company and their tolerance level. I know that there's just been a lot of shift over the past couple of years with the FDA, with specifically in the rare community. When you think about Operation Warp Speed and some of those things too, depending on your company's, I guess, risk tolerance, I think may often shape that as well too. So and it really, really good. I think one other thing I would just say, I know we're getting close to wrapping up our time. It's been really good. The importance of insights, right? I think that's we had one of your colleagues on that's a part of Regeneron that's working on the Insights platform, building out an Insights infrastructure.
Nice.
And really it was focused around
Carl DeLuca from the oncology side.
Yes. Okay. So like, how do we even think about that? Like we're, that's one of the things that I'm in my role in the strategy role that I'm in now. How do we bring in, when you think about 360 insights from all different components, right? So social media certainly is one that's always talked about, but how do you think about that even in incorporating that from beginning, from the patient voice as well too? How is there a way to bring all of those things together? I think it's kind of where we should go next from an organizational standpoint.
Yeah, you're spot on. And that's another awesome place where patient advocacy gets the opportunity to show its impact and its value. So through these relationships, we're able to do or deploy surveys. And so those surveys, 9 times out of 10, the advocacy group is comfortable with the industry partner developing those questions, and they're more than happy to deploy that to their community. Knowing and understanding that there's a difference between market research, which is just dealing with the lay patient, and the patients that engage with advocacy groups who tend to be, as Mary highlighted, really informed and engaged with their condition, right? So you get that diversity in insights that are gathered because of the, various levers that you're pulling by, connecting and collaborating cross-functionally. But for sure, that's a key thing that we definitely rely on is utilizing those, either an assessment, like we want to understand, we think this is a great idea. Hey, patient advocacy group B or A, does your community want this? Great, let's do a survey. No, they don't want it. Or resoundingly, yes, they want it. And if you're going to do it, here's how they want to see it done. Those are definitely insights that patient advocacy is able to pull into the organization.
One more question for you when we wrap up. I promise This is the last one. So I'm listening to you. Number one, you're so engaging. You're so well versed in this, in all sincerity, and your passion about this. I'm one of these people Mary would attest is I'm always like, well, what do we do in the future? Where do we see medical affairs in 10 years? Or where do we see this or that and the other? So I guess my question to you, with your strategic thinking, your nonlinear outside the box, where you've seen the role with patient advocacy in the past 5-10 years, where would you like to see it continue to advance the next 5 or 10?
I'd like to see patient advocacy really, because, and this is it's a challenging one to answer, because all industry patient advocacy functional folks, I think we all have this challenge where we're still in this place of having to explain why what we do is extremely valuable and critical to the business. I want to take a step back to just really, give a shout out and clap up to all of the functions who are recognizing that. So, medical affairs has been very strong in including and inviting patient advocacy into the room at all times. Commercial is also doing a better job. So I wanted, in the next 5 to 10 years, I'd like to see not just an invitation, but like a permanent seat at the table for patient advocacy across all internal functions, right? And really being seen as a gold mine for how and where to engage the patient community. Really just being seen as that place where we can't do anything if we don't have the patient advocacy function in the room. And that's for me in the next 5 to 10 years, what I'd really like to see happen. And then I'd also like to see this function heralded as change agents within the organization, right? And so when you think about how things can shift, because it's beyond just the work that we do out, getting folks to change how they're seeing their condition or treatment options, et cetera, outside, but also bringing more of the outside inside and using that as a mechanism for changing everything that we do. Like I'm struggling not to say patient-centric because everybody uses that word.
That's right.
It's deeper than being patient-centric, and it's more associated with, as you kind of alluded to earlier, Chad, is that human element, right? And remembering that this is your mom, this is your dad, this could be your brother, your sister, your cousin, your favorite teacher, and operating with this person in mind in how we're approaching the work that we do.
So I think this is a great way to wrap things up. I mean, I think you and I share similar interests. I think one of the things I've shared this multiple times on the show, but I wrote a personal mission statement a few years ago, which was to equip individuals, teams, and organizations with strategies and tactics that position medical affairs as a strategic pillar within pharmaceutical industry. And I can see the same thing in the importance of patient advocacy, having that same type of of role. Instead of just being this supplemental or this supportive function, just like medical affairs has been a supportive function to commercial sales for years, and trying to shift that narrative. I think the exact same, you're saying the exact same thing is how do we put if we're going to put patients at the center, or patients at the heart, or whatever that we do, right. On a corporate website, we need to be able to back those things up. And so that is one way. So thanks for the challenge that you've given. I mean, we have a lot of different types of listeners on here, including C-suite, VP levels, all those types of things too. And I think that this is something that they need to hear as well too. And so thank you for reinforcing that with us, Margaret. Anything you want to leave us as we wrap up today?
I would just leave with one of my favorite quotes, which is "Don't go through life, grow through life." And I feel like my experience in pharma has definitely been a calling card for that. I take every opportunity to grow across various opportunities or across various functions, and how I engage with those functions. I always do my best to ensure that I'm leaving things better than when I found them. And that is hinged on my love of that quote, which is to not go through, but grow through.
I love that. I don't even know how to tie up anything after that. That was really good. So, Margaret, thanks so much for taking time to connect with us today. Connect with our listeners. Listeners, thank you so much again for joining another episode of MSLead Chronicles, where leaders learn from leaders. Remember, leaders don't develop in isolation. We learn from one another. Leaders learn from leaders. And as Margaret said, let's don't just go through life. Let's grow through life. And with that, we'll see you next time.
Wonderful.